What's up guys, this is tcgsam here, and in today's video I'm coming at you guys with a deck difficulty tier list. I took the 20 decks that I mentioned in my Age of Overlord tier list. If you haven't checked out already, be sure to do so using the link in the description so you have a better idea of what the top meta decks are going to be for this next format. As a new format approaches, many people try out different decks, and I think this would be useful for them to know which decks are the easiest to pick up and which decks may require a bit more practice. Now, before we get into things, I just want to quickly go over a few disclaimers. So first of all, if I put it in the needs practice tier, for example, I'm not saying that people who play the deck are all very skillful at the game or better than others at the game. And likewise, if I put it in very forgiving, I'm not saying only bad players play the deck. Rather, I'm only judging based on my own experiences from playing against the deck, just to see how easy it would be to pick up and play in a competitive setting. And remember, at the end of the day, this is my opinion and my opinion only. So with all that being said, let's just hop straight into it. So first, quickly going over the tiers, the needs practice tier, like I mentioned, these are the decks that require you to have a strong knowledge of what the deck does and the meta around it in order to play it competitively, because either the deck is hard, it has a lot of difficult lines that you need to memorize, or it has very strange interactions with the meta out there. So these are the decks you probably want to get some testing in before you take to a competitive event. Unforgiving is similar except that you are going to get away with a few mistakes here or there, but for the most part, your mistakes are still going to be punished because the deck does require a more experienced pilot to play it at a competitive level. Average difficulty decks are those that you can probably just learn the combo lines online and play a few games here or there, and you probably do pretty fine with it at a competitive tournament. Forgiving is you can make quite a few mistakes with the deck, but due to either the sheer power of the deck or the simplicity of the deck, those mistakes usually go unpunished for the most part. And finally, very forgiving is like forgiving, except now you can probably get away with making a lot more mistakes than you should be able to while playing these decks, but it just goes to show how powerful these decks in this tier are. So now hopping into the tier list. The very first deck is going to be Branded Despia. So Branded Despia, I think, is probably my definition of like an average difficulty deck. There are some standard combo lines you should know, but of course, there are also a couple of intricacies that come with playing the deck. Now that being said, I wanted to make this based on the skill floor rather than the skill ceiling of the deck, and I think Branded Despia as a deck is fairly simple to pick up. You know generally what you're going for every turn, and the deck is sort of flexible enough to where even if you make a few mistakes here or there, some of the cards are just so powerful that it doesn't really matter for the most part. That being said, there are going to be a couple of things that you will pick up from playing this deck for a longer time, and those separate the best Branded Despia players from the average ones. But at the end of the day, this is a pretty fair deck to just pick up and play, learn a few combos here or there, play 1 or 2 games, and you should be able to play it pretty well in a competitive setting just because of how strong the deck is. Now next up is going to be Pendulum, or specifically, because we're in Age of Overlord format, the Zark deck. So from what I've seen, at least, I would say Pendulum decks are generally pretty unforgiving. You need to have a pretty strong knowledge of what each of your cards do and how they interact with each other, not just learning what the combos are, because there are a lot of times you are going to have to freestyle a few combos here or there when playing through disruptions or when you open a weird hand. And I think the Zark deck is no exception. Now, if you are pretty good with the Pendulum cards, this can be a very strong deck because a lot of people are unfamiliar with the Pendulum cards, meaning you can probably get away with making a few mistakes here or there and not have it be punished by people since they don't know what the deck does. But at the end of the day, playing against other experienced players can be difficult unless you know yourself how they work together. So at the end of the day, I would say the Zark deck is a pretty unforgiving deck. You should definitely do some testing with it and at least understand all the cards in your deck and how they interact with each other and the other cards in the meta more fully before you start playing this deck in a competitive setting. Next up is Unchained. I think Unchained is, as a skill floor, is probably around average. They have a few set combo lines that are pretty easy to do once you remember them, but like Branded Despia, the skill ceiling of this deck can be pretty high. So there are going to be a lot of good players out there who are able to do some battle phase tricks, for example, with their Unchained monsters, or play around certain hand traps better than the average players can. But due to how strong these cards can be, even an average player can still do pretty well with it, just knowing the regular combos and having played 1 or 2 games, and generally knowing how the cards interact with each other. So I would say this is a pretty average skill floor deck, but like Branded Despia, has a pretty high skill ceiling. Next up is TG. So TG, I would say, is probably a deck you absolutely need practice with in order to do well competitively, at least. I'm not saying that combos are more difficult than any other combo deck out there. I think that because these cards are somewhat inherently weaker than the other cards in the meta, you're going to need to have mastered them in order to do super well with them. You need to be super confident in the combos that you're doing and your understanding of the cards themselves, just so when you're playing against Disruption or when you have those awkward hands, you're going to be able to still build a respectable board regardless. So I think that because of how much of a disadvantage you might be just based on the quality of the cards in this deck itself, you probably want to get a lot of testing with this deck to make sure that it's resilient enough in the meta before you're actually able to play it at the most competitive level. Alright, so next up is going to be Sword Soul. So Sword Soul, I think, is pretty forgiving of a deck. You have very simple cards, and generally the game plan of the deck is pretty simple. It did come out a few years ago, and despite the power creep, it still does what it does fairly well. Now, once you learn the basic Sword Soul combos, there are going to be a few intricacies here or there that you could do with like the 10E cards or whatever, but for the most part, I'd say generally understanding what the cards do and generally what you're going to want to do when going first and going second is pretty simple with this deck. So I'm gonna put it in the forgiving tier. You can definitely make a few mistakes here or there, so I'd say that Sword Soul is a pretty forgiving deck overall. Next up is Tierlist. So I personally would put Tierlist in like the needs practice tier. I think this is a very strong deck, of course, but due to the nature of the deck and its sort of inherent randomness, you definitely need to understand how your cards work together, just so you know that no matter what you mill, you're going to still be able to put up a respectable board despite either your good luck or your bad luck. It's very difficult to just pick up and play because there are very few set combo lines because of the randomness of the deck, so I suggest playing the deck, testing it a few times before you're actually able to take it to a competitive setting. Next up is Sprite and Sprite variants. So I'd say Sprite variants in general are on the top of average, bottom of unforgiving. Generally, the Sprite cards themselves are fairly easy to understand, and the game plan with the Sprite cards alone are not too difficult. However, when you start mixing them with other engines like Runic for Hire or Live Twins, for example, that's when things get a little more complicated because there are more interactions between the different engines. So I would say that's what makes it a little more difficult to just pick up and play right away. But for the most part, at the end of the day, you are just putting level 2s on the board to get more of your monsters out, making rank 2s, making link 2s, and it's sort of like a toolbox deck at that point. You probably could just pick up and play Sprite having only known like the main interactions between the different engines, but what separates like the best Sprite players from like the average ones, I would say, is their knowledge of how their different engines work well together. So I would say that as a skill floor, it's fairly average, but as a skill ceiling, like these other decks, can be pretty high. Next up is Pearly. So Pearly, I would say, is pretty unforgiving of a deck. You have a lot of small things you need to worry about, so how to play around different non-engine, how to manage your different resources, and as well as how to play through boards and how to sequence your plays correctly. Now, the only reason I don't put this in needs practice is because I would say the one saving grace that makes it a little bit simpler is that generally going first, you really only have one game plan, and that's to set up Noir. So make the baby Noir, and then from there set the trap card, and then make Noir on your opponent's turn. That's sort of the general game plan when going first. And going second, you usually want to go for a Pearly Happiness to attack a bunch of times, either to OTK your opponent, or to make a giant Zeus or a Noir afterwards. So I would say generally the game plan of the deck is fairly simple, but the intricacies of the deck are pretty complex, and therefore I would say you definitely need to have a little bit of practice with this deck if you want to do well with it at a tournament. Next up is Infernoble Knight. I would also say Infernoble Knight's a pretty unforgiving deck. Similar to Pendulums, it has a lot of different potential combo lines. Yes, it has a few combo lines that are set in stone, but when you're going second, that's when things get a little difficult. You're going to need to learn how to sequence your plays correctly and how you can force out different interruptions out there. I'd say the challenge of this deck is not learning the combos, but rather how to adapt on the fly, similar to the other combo deck like Pendulum. Speaking of combo decks, I'd say Manadium is at the bottom of needs practice and the top of unforgiving. I played this deck quite extensively, and I definitely made my fair share of mistakes with this deck that have gotten punished. It's not a very forgiving deck if you make mistakes. Yes, there are a few combos out there that you can learn beforehand, and those will help you, but a lot of the times from when I played the deck, you're going to end up with hands that are quote-unquote either not very good or very awkward, or even too good, and you're going to need to learn how to play those hands optimally and sequence your plays so that they play around the most cards as possible, and that's where the true difficulty of the deck lies. But like the other combo decks, going second is going to always be a challenge with this deck. You're going to need to learn how to sequence your plays correctly. but especially going first, learning to play around different hand traps, because Vanadium at times can be somewhat fragile, and even more fragile so than Pendulums or Infernoble Knights. So it's very important to learn how can I sequence my plays such that I'm protected from the most cards as possible. Next up is Exosister. So Exosister, I think, is the first deck I'm gonna put in Very Forgiving. I would say this deck is fairly easy to understand. Generally, you know you're just making your Exosister rank 4s, setting up Exosister Magnifico when going first. There are a few cards in this deck also that make it very forgiving, I think. So if you start drawing cards like Shifter, it doesn't particularly matter too much if your play is a little bit sloppy or not the best, because Shifter can carry games on its own quite often. And the fact that this deck can play it means you now have an auto win button against a lot of the decks out there that doesn't really require you to do much thinking. Now, that being said, I would say that there are a few intricacies on how to play this deck properly, how to play around certain cards or sequence your plays correctly. But generally, I'd say the cards are very simple when they work together, and you know for sure, like going first, I want to get my Michaelis, search a spell or trap. I want to make Caspatel to search Martha, for example, if I don't have it, and sort of go from there. So I would say that's a pretty simple deck to pick up, and definitely one that can be very forgiving even if you make a couple of mistakes with it. Next up is Branded Chimera. So I would say that Branded Chimera is like at the bottom of unforgiving and the top of average. So it has very simple one-card combos, you know, Mirror Sword Knight and Cornfield Kotal. That's probably the only combo really you need to know with this deck. But I'll say the difficulty with this deck comes from learning when to use your disruptions. So at the end of your turn, you're going to have at the very least a Mirror Sword Knight as well as a Chimera Fusion. So I'll say just understanding when you should be using your Chimera Fusion to summon cards like Guardian Chimera is very important when playing this deck. It's not as simple as just shotgunning it on the first opportunity you're able to do so. The fact that this deck has that sort of flexibility can make it hard as well, just because it doesn't really have much linear combos past its turn 1. So I'll say just learning to manage your resources and learning when to use your disruptions is pretty important for the Chimera deck. So I would definitely recommend a few games with the Chimera deck before you're actually able to go and play it at a competitive level. Next up are these Cybers decks. So I put Salamangreat here as the face of it, but generally I'm referring to decks like Marincess, Mathmech, and Salad. And I'll say that these are on average pretty average difficulty decks. They have quite a few linear combos that you can do with either one card or 1 or 2 cards, and if you know those for the most part, you're pretty much good to go. The reason I'm only putting in average and not more difficult is because I would say going second, these decks have a very similar game plan aside from perhaps Marincess, where you're just trying to go for Update Jammer and access code to OTK your opponent. At that point, you're just slapping bodies on the board and hoping your opponent doesn't remove them, and then making Update Jammer access code to just kill them from there. So that's a pretty simple going second game plan. Going first, you can just try to do your regular combo. If you get disrupted, there isn't too much wiggle room with the deck. Once you know the basic combo lines, you should be good to go. At the end of the day, even if the skill floor of this deck is pretty average, there are going to be a few players who are a cut above the rest when they're able to specifically sequence their plays to start playing around those disruptive cards. And then next up is Dark Worlds. I would say that Dark Worlds, from my experience at least playing it, is fairly unforgiving. While you do know that you are just trying to turbo out your turbo through your deck with like discard outlets and drawing cards, at the end of the day, I would still say that sequencing your plays can be pretty important with the Dark World deck. Yes, there are going to be some hands that sort of just play themselves, like you have 4 Dark World monsters and 1 danger, for example. Not much you can really do there other than activate the danger. But I would say that knowing how to make sure you're able to keep your engine rolling as you go throughout your turn can be very important. So when going first, you need to know like, oh, okay, what are sort of like the big choke points that I have when I'm trying to turbo through my deck? Is it cards like Dugaras, for example, where if my opponent imprims it, I just have to pass my turn? And if that's the case, is there a way I can play around it? So things like that when going first. Going second, at that point, you are just trying to get as many bodies out onto the board as possible and break your opponent's board. So it's a little bit simpler in that case. But I would say when going first, there are going to be times where you do get hit with cards like Drone Lockboard, Dimension Shifter, and that can make things a little difficult when you're playing this deck. So next up is going to be Vanquished Soul. I would say that Vanquished Soul is probably also a fairly unforgiving deck. You should have a little bit of practice with this deck, in addition to knowing what the cards do themselves. I think the important part about this deck is resource management, making sure that the resources in your hand match the type of disruptions that you're going for. And that's definitely something that comes with practice. I think at the end of the day, just knowing like, oh, when should I be adding this monster or that spell or trap, and when should I be using my Link 1 to summon, and when should I be using my Link 1 to add back. I think these are all different things that come from playing the deck for a while and that you can't really pick up just by knowing what the cards do themselves. So I'd say that Vanquish Soul is a fairly unforgiving deck that definitely requires a bit of practice. Next up is Dragon Link. I would say that this is a deck that most definitely requires you to have some practice, just because of how essentially the deck is like a dragon toolbox. You don't have that many combo lines that are set in stone, and just being able to know like how do these extenders work with my starter cards, for example, and what interruptions can I push through when I have these certain combinations of cards is something that's also very important. Also, at the end of the day, you're going to have to make decisions very often, like, oh, should I play around Nibiru here, or should I play around cards like Dark Ruler No More, or something like that in those cases. So I would say the difficulty of the deck comes from just not only understanding how every dragon card is able to work together, but also playing around those different cards out there, because at the end of the day, this deck can technically get hit by cards like Nibiru, Droll, Dark Ruler, stuff like that. All those cards can potentially hit it, but as a skilled Dragon Link player, you probably have ways to play around it, and I think that's something you should be picking up when you're trying to go ahead and learn that deck. So next up is going to be Fluandereeze. I would say similarly as Exosister, it's a fairly forgiving deck. Even if you make a few misplays with the deck, the fact that it has a bunch of auto win buttons, so things like Dimension Shifter and Harpy's Featherstorm, just make it so even if you aren't playing at your best, like those cards just win games on their own. Not to mention that the engine is very snowbally, meaning once you get it going, it's probably the best engine in the game in terms of resources, because you're essentially never running out, and it's very difficult for your opponent to be able to stop you once you start snowballing that advantage. So I'd say overall, it's a fairly forgiving deck, just because of the amount of auto win buttons it has, but also just because of the inherent nature of the engine and how snowbally it is. Alright, so next up is going to be Labyrinth, so Furniture Labyrinth, more specifically, and Trap Labyrinth. I would say this is probably like somewhat of a forgiving deck. For if you're playing the trap variant like the Floodgates, because like I mentioned with the 2 decks down here, just having auto wins in your deck just make it so much simpler, where you won't necessarily have to think about your plays too much, and you can get away with playing a little bit worse. Now that being said, the Furniture Labyrinth deck, I would say, is probably on the other end of the spectrum, like sort of unforgiving. So I should probably put Labyrinth just in here, because on average, it's an average skill floor deck. Learning to manage your resources with the Furniture build is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, those are inherent -1s. So being able to understand, oh, when should I be flipping my traps and when should I be using these Furniture cards can be very important, and I would say definitely make or break the Labyrinth player's game. So the better Labyrinth players are definitely going to understand how their cards interact with the meta and when the right time to use their cards are, whereas some of the newer Labyrinth players might have to just stick to like the Floodgate build just to keep things a little bit simpler, and have more auto win buttons, so that even if you aren't playing that great, you are going to just get carried by some of those cards out there. And then next up is Rescue Ace. So Rescue Ace, I'd say, is also a pretty unforgiving deck. Just like Pearly, in general, you know your game plan going first is to set up Turbulence, but the deck has a couple of new ways to get there with the Diabellstar cards now. The Diabellstar cards are going to allow you to get that extra extender engine now that you didn't have previously beforehand, and that sort of opens up a new avenue of thinking like, oh, what should I do first in order to force out my opponent's interactions so that I can push my Turbulence through and resolve its effect. So now that you have this extra engine at your disposal, I think that makes the deck a little bit more complicated, because now you're thinking about how to sequence your plays with your Rescue Ace engine and the Bellstar engine. In addition to that, you're also going to have to start thinking about how to play around different cards out there. Like, do I go for a full combo that plays around cards like Duster and Lightning Storm, or do I go for a very conservative combo that plays around cards like Nibiru? So these are questions that you need to be asking yourself, and in addition to that, knowing when to flip your interruptions as well and sequence them is also very important in a deck like this. Value from those interruptions you have come from timing them. You're going to be able to stop your opponents from advancing their plays further, and that sort of requires you to have a good knowledge of your opponent's deck. So I'd say at the end of the day, it's a fairly unforgiving deck. While you generally know that your game plan, you definitely should have some practice with this deck before taking it to a competitive event. And finally, Rika Sun Avalon. I would say this is probably a deck you need practice with if you want to do super well with it. Not only is even its regular combo can be sort of difficult to remember everything just because of how long it is and how many different stuffs there are, but I'd say that especially the hands where you don't have your 1-card starters like Unexpected Die or Lokai, you are going to have to learn sort of what the best end board is to go for is. Like, should I end with just a con and a trap, or should I end with more monsters on the board or as much monsters on the board as I can? And especially when going second and facing disruptions, I'd say that since the Rika deck is somewhat non-linear, if you don't have the Loci combo, you probably should have an understanding of how your different plant cards work together and how they can be used to make boards and under disruption or break boards through different disruptions out there. So at the end of the day, I definitely recommend testing a lot with this deck if you were to play it at a big event, because it's also a pretty hard deck to understand, like how should I play for follow-up and how should I play through different boards out there, like I mentioned before. That's gonna do it for the tier list. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Hopefully you guys enjoy this new style of tier list. I know it's not like any other tier list you've seen on the internet out there. So if you enjoy this type of content, I'll be happy to make more every single format out there. So I hope that you were able to learn a little bit more about how difficult each of these decks may be to pick up and play, and it helped you in your decision on what deck you should be playing. So with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys all in the next one. Take care.